Buenos dias, it's me, Señorita Hebert. I'm here to talk to you today about stem changing verbs in Spanish. As you've already learned, you already know a whole bunch of regular AR, ER, and IR verbs in Spanish. So let's do a really quick review of their endings because you'll need those for this lesson. The AR verb endings are o, as, a, amos, ais, and an. I'm sure you remember. Regular AR verbs are verbs like bailar, to dance, or cantar, the verb to sing. The ER verb endings in Spanish are o, es, e, hemos, eis, and en, as I'm sure you remember. Regular ER verbs are verbs like comer, the Spanish verb to eat, or beber, the Spanish verb to drink. And the IR verb endings are o, es, e, hemos, is, and en, as I'm sure you'll remember. Regular IR verbs in Spanish are verbs like vivir, to live, or escribir, to write. Now, there's another category of verbs in Spanish that we call stem-changing verbs. There are quite a few of them, so let me show you what I mean. You already know where the ending of the verb is, right? For example, if we have the Spanish verb perder, which is the Spanish verb to lose, the ending is here. Remember? Now, if you take a look at what's left over, that is what we call the stem in Spanish. Now, with some verbs in Spanish, the stem also changes when you conjugate them. So there is actually one more step involved, so let's take a look. There are 4 types of stem-changing verbs in Spanish. They are the E to IE stem-changing verbs, the E to I stem-changing verbs, the O to UE, and the U to UE. So let's start today's lesson by taking a look at the verbs that change from E to IE first. One of these verbs is the verb perder that we just saw before, the verb to lose. Is it an AR, ER, or IR verb? As you can see from the ending, it's an ER verb. So it's going to use the ER verb endings, just like it normally would, which are O, es, e, hemos, eis, and en, right? Eventually, you will memorize that the verb perder is an E to IE stem-changing verb. This comes just from practice. There are quite a few verbs in Spanish that will follow the same pattern. Now, these stem-changing verbs are a bit easier to remember if you think about them as boot verbs. So here is my boot. Now, all of the verb forms that fit inside the boot, being the yo form, the tú form, the él, ella, usted form, and the ellos, ellas, and ustedes form, we'll get what's called a stem change when you conjugate the verb. So if we use our example perder, we are going to change the E in the stem to an IE in all of those forms that fit inside the boot. So we end up with yo pierdo, tú pierdes, él, ella, usted pierde, and ellos, ellas, ustedes pierden. See? Now, all of the verb forms that fit inside the boot get that stem change. However, the nosotros and the vosotros forms do not get stem changes. And that's why we leave them outside of the boot. So they do not change. You will just conjugate them like you normally would. So we end up with perdemos, we lose, or perdes. You do not put that stem change in. There are quite a few E to IE stem-changing verbs, and you will eventually start to remember which verbs are stem-changing verbs and which are just regular verbs. This just comes through plenty of practice. So now let's take a look at the second type of stem-changing verb, verbs that change E to I. So an example is the verb pedir, which is to ask for, request, or order in Spanish. The E of the stem will change to an I in those forms that fit inside the boot. So the yo form, the tú form, the él, usted, and the ellos, ellas, ustedes. Just like our other example. So, pedir is an IR verb. So the endings we use will be o, es, imos, is, and en, right? But once we conjugate that verb in its 6 forms, we're going to change the E to an I in the forms that fit in the boot. So we end up with yo pido, tú pides, él, usted pide, and ellos, ellas, and ustedes piden. But, just like we learned before, the nosotros and vosotros forms do not get that changed. So the nosotros form of the verb pedir would be pedimos, and the vosotros form would be pedís. You follow me? So, now we're going to change, we're going to move to the 3rd type of stem changing verb. And that is called an ode to UE stem changing verb. And there are plenty of them too. And like I said before, you will start to learn which ones are stem changers and which ones aren't just through practice. So what happens with these is the O in the stem changes to a UE in the yo, tú, ele, usted, and ellos, ellas, ustedes forms. So an example of an O to UE stem changing verb is the verb dormir, the Spanish verb to sleep. Dormir is an IR verb, so we'll use the IR verb endings. O, es, imos, is, and en, right? But the O in the stem is going to change to UE in the boot. So we end up with duermo, duermes, duerme, and duermen. But just like before, the stem change only occurs in those 4 forms, not in the nosotros or vosotros. So, to say we sleep in Spanish, you will have dormimos without the UE. And vosotros form will be dormís, again, without the UE. And the very last category of stem changing verbs in Spanish is what's called the U to UE stem changing verbs. And there's only one of them. And that verb is the verb jugar, which is the verb to play in Spanish. And it's the only verb that does this. But its U will change to a UE in those 4 forms. So, jugar is an AR verb. The AR verb endings are o, as, a, amos, ais, and an. But the U of the stem will change to a UE in those 4 forms again. So to say I play in Spanish, you say yo juego. You play would be tú juegas. He or she plays would be él o ella juega. And they play would be ellos or ellas juegan. But just like the other 3 types of stem changing verb, the only forms that change are those 4. So the nosotros form will just be jugamos. And the vosotros form will be jugáis. You understand? And that's the only one that does that. So the only other thing to keep in mind when conjugating stem changing verbs is this. When we have a verb that is a stem changer, like the verb preferir, the Spanish verb to prefer, do you notice how there are 2 E's in the stem? It causes a problem for us. Which E is the one that changes? The rule for that is this. Since preferir is an IR verb, you will use the IR verb endings. So again, we would use o, es, imos, is, and en, right? Now, since we are left with our stem, you actually are going to change the E that is closest to that ending. So we're going to change this E, the second E, in. And what you would end up with is then prefiero, prefieres, prefiere. See how we change the second E to an IE? Nosotros would stay the same, preferimos, vosotros would be preferís, and ellos, ellas, and ustedes would be prefieren. And that's it. So, now it's time for you to go practice. Good luck, buena suerte, y adiós.